Welcome to the Long Take Review, where four college professors talk film, providing insight, not assigning homework. I'm your host, Jen Subchakshai-Bankard, and I'm here with two boys who would never have made it through Nickel. First, he just wants a hug from Anjanu Ellis. It's PT McNiff. How's it going, PT?
If everybody looks the other way, then everybody's in on it. If I look the other way, I'm as implicated as the rest. I'm doing well, Jen. How are you?
I'm doing great. That was well chosen. That was a nice quote. And he ate some soap powder to try to get out of this recording, but it didn't take. It's Antonio Elefano. How are you doing, Antonio?
It's not an obstacle course, Jen. You can't go around it. You have to go through it. Walk with your head up no matter what they throw at you. I'm doing great, Jen.
Wow. It's so much inspiration, and we're only not even a minute in. I love it. Okay. So those, dear listeners, were all references to the film we are here to review today, Ramel Ross's adaptation of the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by Colson Whitehead, Nickel Boys. Its story follows two Black teenagers serving time in a reform school in Jim Crow-era Florida. The radically composed historical drama has been nominated for 2 Oscars and is available to rent or buy at home. That's not to say you can't see it in a theater. I didn't actually check that, but it if it is in theaters, it's probably only at a few, would be my guess. If you're listening to us for the first time, we will have a spoiler-free section designed for those who have not yet seen Nickel Boys, and then with a very clear alert, we will shift into spoiler mode for the rest of the show. And there is, I would say, at least one major spoiler. So you have been warned, like this is a real spoiler warning when the time comes. PT, if listeners don't want to hire a lawyer to get them out of listening to another episode, what can they do?
Well, if they don't want to miss new episodes when they drop, they should follow the Long Take Review wherever they get their podcast. We host the feed on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com, but you can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Overcast, YouTube, and many more. You can also follow us on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at The Long Take Review, and also on Letterboxd. The account is at LTRPod, or you can search for the hashtag LTRPod to see what each of us individually has been watching. Jen?
Thanks, PT. So we are just about ready to get into our discussion of Nickel Boys, but first, it's the Oscars are coming fast, people. So we got a movie news update.
Just in off the wire, it's your Hollywood news.
Okay, so yes, we had 2 more big precursors. The WGAs took place on Saturday, and then the BAFTAs were on Sunday. There were quite a few additional shakeups. So my favorite post afterwards was, I believe it was Clayton Davis. The headline of his piece after the BAFTAs was like, the Oscars race, still chaotic and crazy? Yes, it's still chaotic and crazy. So what to both of you kind of stuck out as the either biggest surprises or just like what's the headlines kind of coming out of this weekend?
Well, one caveat with the Writers Guild Awards is because the Writers Guild has very strict rules about what's eligible and what's not. There were certain films that are very much in the Oscar hunt that were not in the running. So, for example, I think Conclave was not eligible, right, for adapted screenplay, and that's what won at BAFTAs. But what won at WGA for adapted screenplay was the film that we are reviewing today, Nickel Boys, which was a wonderful win. I'm excited to talk about that screenplay in more depth today. So that was probably the most satisfying. Although I also was surprised and loved Jesse Eisenberg at the BAFTAs winning for A Real Pain. That I think was a pretty big surprise. And A Real Pain has been getting a lot of attention, just constant attention for Kieran Culkin. It was nice to see Jesse Eisenberg pick up a prize. I think he actually picked up Kieran Culkin's prize too, because he wasn't there. But he earned, he earned this award, and it was nice to see him win a piece of hardware. So that's the biggest thing for me. How about you all?
Jesse Eisenberg actually also presented an award, I believe. So he was actually on stage 3 times during the BAFTAs.
Oh, wonderful.
Which, considering he's not British, is very impressive.
And he seems like someone who just loves a lot of extra attention, like very comfortable with it.
Well,
at ease.
I know. His acceptance speech for screenplay started with, I'd like to thank my wife who's not here because even she thought I wasn't going to win. Like It was really
Great.
funny.
Yeah, I also like that. That he got a win there. That's really fun. To me, the sort of the momentum, we talked about it in our previous episode. The momentum was really moving towards Honora, and I think what happened now is this past weekend could have really solidified, kind of just locked it down, and that to the Clayton Davis headlines point that like it's no longer crazy. Like we're on it. We're on the train. The train's moving. Where Honora is just taking a bunch of the big awards, and that's going to be fine. And we're not on that train, but it's not like Honora came across as weak because it did win the WGA for as stated for screenplay. And even though it didn't win for picture or director at BAFTAs, it did win lead actress for Mikey Madison.
And that was a huge upset. I don't think
Yes,
anyone had really predicted that. Mikey, like I think the idea was that BAFTA wasn't necessarily a Mikey Madison favoring crowd potentially, right? But it really upset. Like everyone kind of assumed it was going to be Demi Moore, and all the other acting categories had sort of followed in line with previous wins, and so I think everyone had just kind of gotten complacent about it's going to be the same, and then Mikey Madison wins over Demi Moore, which was very even to her was very surprising. I think.
And this might be like wish casting, but I had sort of gone in assuming if there's going to be an upset of like not the front runner Demi Moore, it would be Marianne Jean-Baptiste, who's British and is has been underrepresented in some of these other major awards. So that felt like maybe, and then suddenly Honora comes in with a big win there. Maybe that's just the Demi Moore legacy from the 80s doesn't play in England. They're just like, okay, like whatever. They were not as into Demi Moore movies in the 80s and 90s, so her comeback narrative might not have been as strong there. But it does still feel like, and I think there was another Honora won best casting, which BAFTA has as a preview of the future Oscar category. So it was still winning awards there, and of course it still has this big accumulation of DGA, PGA, WGA. So Honora is still the front runner, but we'll have to see how things go at SAG because Conclave won both best British picture and also best picture overall at the BAFTAs. That was somewhat predicted. Jen was predicting that as both a chaos pick and also a realistic pick because that's also how All Quiet on the Western Front kind of got more into the conversation that year. The last Edward Berger movie was because it performed well at the BAFTAs. So we still have to be on alert for what happens at SAG this upcoming weekend because that what happens with that best ensemble is like that could just as easily, like Conclave feels like such a movie you'd be like, look at all these actors and we love them all, like give that one best ensemble, and even if that wasn't, people were voting for that without thinking about the connection to best picture, suddenly it's like, oh wait a minute, like the triangulation of who's in the lead for the Oscars is going to be all over the place. Maybe Honora will win that and it will just kind of be like, yep, I guess Honora was sort of there all along, chugging along, doing fine. But yeah, it didn't knock Honora down, but it didn't elevate Honora into sort of done deal.
Yeah, I think the trickiest thing about Honora overall is that it's not the type of film that is really going to do much below the line. And so it's win package, so to speak. That's the term that Oscar pundits use. It's win package or it's path to the Oscars, right? It's Oscar puzzle, however you want to say it, right? It has to really dominate kind of above the line. And so, I think the screenplay for most people was kind of the linchpin for that. So if that's now in question because it couldn't pull off a win at BAFTA, it is interesting. And then I also think a lot of people are saying, well, if it's going to win picture and director, wouldn't Mikey Madison need to come along with it, right? Like why would we be nominating this movie in other huge categories and the actress who is arguably the movie, the movie is named, her character is the name of the movie, right? Like why that doesn't quite make sense. And so a lot of people are kind of debating, is it like kind of this almost all or nothing sort of thing? Like can it get enough to actually push it over the line to best picture? So I think that and Conclave getting editing at BAFTA, that was actually the sign that I was like, oh, I'm right. It's going to win both best picture categories. This is crazy.
Two quick shout outs. Love Dune Part 2 winning for best sound. which somehow it's still not the favorite for that in the Oscars. People seem to still be predicting that Wicked would win that, but I think Dune has been winning a lot of these, the smaller sound categories along the way. So I like that. And also, of course, as always, shout out to Kneecap, outstanding debut by a British writer, director, or producer for the
Sure.
one British man involved in making Kneecap. Now,
We'll
I mean,
see.
I know we don't want to belabor it too much, but is there any grommet
You
mentum
you
from
want I
this?
was gonna say you want me to rant about Wallace and Gromit. Okay, so
I mean,
and then we'll
it
move
doesn't
on.
mean anything, or is it just that this is a very British movie and British people love Wallace and Gromit?
I think it's that. But first of all, I got very upset because my kids were actually watching the BAFTAs with me for a good portion of it, and I was like, they like what I like. This is great.
It's
And it's
happening.
happening. We're bonding. Even though they had lots of questions, but they were like, when they
What's a
showed the
win
clip,
package? Shut up.
when they showed the clip montages for both of those categories, they got really excited about Flo and the Wild Robot, right? Because those are movies they have seen and
Yeah,
have enjoyed, and so they
sure.
were like, "Yeah, let's do it." And then when Wallace and Gromit wins, they were like, "We didn't like that movie. The gnomes were creepy. Like what's
Yeah,
going on?" They like other Wallace and Gromit movies. They
sure.
like we watched A Curse of the Were Rabbit over the holidays, and they were terrified during most of it, but into it because of the bunnies. But yeah, so they were like all the investment. It was like everyone who liked Barbie last year at the Oscars, and then
Yeah.
we're like, wait, what? Like it doesn't win anything. And they were like, when's Roz coming back? And I'm like, well, here's Lupita Nyong'o presenting another award. So yeah, it was. But yeah, all that said, some pundits are starting to be like, oh, does this mean it's a three-way race now? What is going on? But I think it is more speaks to Flo's weakness in the international voting bloc more than it speaks to Wallace and Gromit's strength, if that makes sense, right? Like you could chalk up the British just were really excited and they love their Aardman movies. And like to be fair, when they won, they brought the little models up on the stage. It was adorable. Like I was like, oh, Feathers McGraw looks great. Like even though I was pretty meh about Vengeance Most Foul, like um they look cute. So obviously it's like I think it's a national treasure situation, you know.
That's fair. I like Vengeance Most Foul. I mean, I don't think I liked it as much. I didn't like it as much as Flo for sure, and I don't think I liked it more than Wild Robot. But like, let him have it. Let him have this win. Is my
Yeah,
take on
it's a
it.
fine movie. It's fine. Like it's
But I
not
didn't
bad.
have children
It's just when
disappointed
you
next to me.
yeah.
So look, I guess my last question on this is it overvaluing the sort of the British contingent of the Academy to look at the BAFTAs as a bellwether for international voters?
I mean, last year they were really strong predictors of the Oscar wins.
Hmm. Okay.
Like I think visual effects might have been the only big category that didn't cross over. So but that's only last year. Like if you go back, like I think the year Everything Everywhere won Best Picture, there was like a red herring at the BAFTAs. I can't remember which film it was. That might have been
It was Banshees, I think.
Banshees. Yeah. All right, but that's it. Let's get to it. So, what was everybody's short take of Nickel Boys?
I thought it was absolutely stunning. Often experimenting with form in any genre of art, and that happens here. This is a film told in the first person, so the camera, you see things through the eyes of whichever character point of view you're in. So you're not viewing them traditionally. You don't get to see their facial expressions when they're having conversations. You're looking at what they are seeing. Often those kinds of experiments results in something you respect more than you love, something that commands the mind but fails to engage the heart. And this is not that. There's definitely a disorientation upon watching through the first person. And it took me probably a good half hour to sort of settle in um, and sort of like accept that like, this is the way that this experience is going, and I'm just going to believe that there's going to be a payoff for this, and there is. It's a massive. I think that the experiment pays massive dividends by the film's end, um, and I thought it was just like a movie unlike anything that I'd ever seen before. Um, and I can't say enough good things about it. I'm looking forward to diving deep in. Uh, PT, what did you think?
I'm very much in agreement with what you just said, Antonio. I was, I believe, on the record once the trailer for this came out, or even just the description
Hmm.
of it out of the
Sure.
first major film festival, to be like, oh, it's in first person perspective. I don't think that's a good idea. I'm probably not going to like that. And I was absolutely wrong. And I'm glad that I still went and checked it out and got the experience to watch it with both of you at a wonderful screening with the director and cinematographer and actress. I will note, because our absent colleague Greg would make it clear to say that we were unduly seduced by their discussion afterwards to love the movie more than he did. But yeah, I was like, I don't know about this idea. It felt like a gimmick going into it. I was like, okay, I guess that's like a thing you could do. And as it was starting, it kind of quickly won me over. Is it like, well, this isn't just a gimmick. This has a resonance, but I don't know if I'm like as connected to it as I would be if it was just sort of filmed in a quote unquote normal way or traditional way. But as it unfolds, I got sucked in more and more into the experience of it and the world of it, and there were a few sort of twists and tweaks. And I don't want to say twists as if like, ooh, and then a curtain was pulled back, but just sort of changes in what was happening in the narrative and in the structure of the movie, where I was like, I don't like this. Like, this is another thing. This is a mistake. And every one of those paid off and
Mhm.
made me look a fool in my own brain for thinking that it was not going to work out. So yeah, I was really blown away at the end of this. And I mentioned in our previous episode, when we were looking back at all of our 100th episode that we recently recorded, and one of the questions we sort of threw around was, what's a movie whose opinion you have changed? And my answer was The Zone of Interest, because I haven't rewatched it, but I've thought about it a lot. And every time I think about it, it sort of grows in my esteem. And that has a similar experience has been happening for me with Nickel Boys. It's been a little while since we saw it. I have not gone back and had a chance to see it again. But like every passing week, when I sort of it comes back into my mind, and I'm just like, man, blown away by how good it was. So not very short for a short take, but I really liked it, is my very short take. Jen, how about you?
Yeah, I'll say I won't add too much, but this is one of my favorite movies of last year. And I think, to kind of set the record straight, at least I can only speak for myself, but it wasn't so much that once we heard the Q&A with the creators of this film, that suddenly I went from being confused to like elated and enlightened, right? Like, to me, it was just articulating in such a crisp way what I had already experienced and what my brain in real time was processing when I was watching the movie. And so, like, I definitely think that it's one of those movies where, yeah, PT said it's not a gimmick, but I would even go so far as to say, like, as an intellectual exercise, it is like the perfect marriage of theme and style. Like, it's like the stylistic choices being made not only are visually interesting and kind of innovative and experimental, but they actually tie in with the story, and I think improve how the story could be told in various ways, right? And Greg's probably listening to this being like, but you haven't read the book, Jen. And it's true, I haven't read the book. None of us have read the book. Greg pleaded that we pass along that everyone should read the book. It's one of Greg's favorite books.
And
And
we have a few more detailed comments
yes,
from Greg that we have to wait for spoiler territory, I think, to get into.
correct.
So
But yeah, that's my plug on behalf of Greg, is that, he's coming at this with a much different perspective because he read the book first. But I think I would say that, I think what regardless of how it does as an adaptation of the source material, I'd say that the what it's doing with the source material and what it turns it into is pretty astounding. All right. So, recommendation algorithm, in which we establish the audience of a film. So we acknowledge that not every film is for everyone. So is this the audience that we'd recommend this movie to a little bit narrower than average because of kind of what we just talked about in terms of the filmmaking style, and that it kind of does require some unlearning on the viewer's part, I would say, in terms of like it's just so different than what you're used to watching. What do we think?
That's possible. It also is, both in terms of that sort of that challenge of the form and the style, but also the importance of the story and the subject matter. Like, I kind of think people should be challenged by this, like people who might like not think they would go and have a good time, people who are feel like they'd be pushed out of their comfort zones. Like, that's a good thing. It's hard to recommend, I guess, to people, but maybe you should be challenged by what happens in the story, and the fact that the form of it is going to also be challenging makes it sort of doubly so. Or does it just sort of serve as almost like big arrows being like, hey, this stuff's going to be uncomfortable. So that's sort of where I am of you know thinking about the individual people. I might say you should definitely go see Nickel Boys because you would like it is much smaller, but the people who I think you should go see it because you should see it is as wide, if not wider, than most prestige movies. Antonio, what do you think?
I think that separate and apart from the experiments with form, if people just read the premise or knew generally what Nickel Boys was about, I think I know a lot of people who'd be like, "That sounds really depressing," and I mean, and it is a very heavy movie, but I do think that it's leavened by a lot of moments of joy throughout the movie. We just reviewed for our Sundance review. We talked about Omaha, a movie that had no problem putting its audience through the ringer through sort of the most obvious and heavy-handed ways possible. And I don't want to talk too much about individual scenes, but there were moments here that I think, during that review, I talked about how there was like a lack of artful restraint. There was I feel like restraint here, but also creativity in the way that certain scenes that I was sort of like dreading were presented that made me rethink the ideas that we're going through. Anyway, I don't want to spoil too much, so I'll just say it is a heavy movie, but it doesn't feel as like as relentless as like that film, and perhaps other things that people think of whenever they uh, they're encountering films about difficult childhoods, for example. Jen, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say that there are a couple key choices that make it very clear that the film is not interested in being exploitative about its subject matter, right? Like
Yeah.
it's purposely trying to not present violence and abuse in a way that is kind of voyeuristic. Uh and I think there's a lot of hope in the movie, because of the joyful moments that you kind of talk about. And like it's sort of a big part of the movie, I would say, is, and I think Ramel Ross has called this the epic banal, where it's kind of like
Mhm.
the little things in life, the way that this film presents them, it's with such relish and kind of like lingering that it really is quite beautiful, and not necessarily sad, right? Like it's
Yeah.
yeah, like we're not, I don't want to sugarcoat it. Like there are some horrible things that
Yeah.
happen in this movie, but I think
Yeah.
that it's balanced, I think maybe is the way to put it. So it's not, it doesn't feel like eating your vegetables. Some
Yeah.
movies are so artsy and kind of like museum pieces that are films that it feels, or are so tragic and heavy in their subject matter that it feels like you are forcing yourself to watch it because it's good for you.
Yeah.
Right? I
Yeah.
would not describe this film that way.
I think the obvious parallel that it sort of shares because of the timing of it is Sing Sing, which is another movie set in a prison starring black characters, or about black characters, and does different things in terms of not giving you the sort of standard story that you expect, which if now we're just uh selling earlier episodes to the audience, where it's like, go back, you can go back to the Sing Sing episode as well from last summer, that we talked about that there, where it was like we were all kind of like, is this gonna be just like a drag, like very good but I don't know. And it isn't that, and it's these are very different movies, and it is a different experience watching both of them. But I think if there are people who maybe have seen Sing Sing and we're like, oof, Nickel Boys though, I don't think so, that's going to be too heavy. I think that it isn't the same kind of lightness and joy. It's not as many laughs as you get out of Sing Sing, but it has a similar touch of not sort of just going to cliches and not giving that sort of like same old story of Black suffering that I think a lot of people are used to enduring when they watch something like this. But that, for many reasons, it gives a wider array of both sort of emotional and even sort of just like physical interactions with the world, which is really rewarding, and not just in that way like you ate your vegetables. It's rewarding, but in like your heart is opened because of the experience.
Yeah, I would say that if you at all have any vested interest in history and how we document history, Ramel Ross, before this film, was previously known as a documentarian. Like his, okay,
Hale County this morning, this evening.
yes, okay, that's such a good title. Hale, yes, his previous film was Hale County this morning, this evening, and at first, I remember a couple critics sort of being skeptical that like, and actually one of them might have been Greg in his Letterboxd review, saying that so much respect to this opinion, but saying that like it seemed like he was still stuck in kind of making, he wanted to make a documentary, even though like it felt like he wanted to make a documentary even though he was making a feature film. I don't necessarily agree with that. We could talk about that in spoiler mode, but I just feel like has a lot of ideas about how history is recorded and how we today, how we look back at the past and how we deal with it and stuff like that. So
What I will say in terms of thinking about other movies, this is probably, I doubt there's going to be a lot of people that are like, yes, I do care about that, and therefore I'm going to like Nickel Boys. But just in terms of antecedents, there have been a few things along the way that have tried telling stories in first person. To me, in my mind, the most famous is the British comedy show Peep Show, which
that's
I
right.
think was like 7 or 8 seasons, and is told entirely out of the first person perspectives of mostly the two main characters, who are also the two main writers, I believe, of the show. And that's obviously played for laughs and all of that. And there's been action movies that kind of either in sequences, or the movie Hardcore Henry is the one that I remember as like the entire movie was done. And it kind of was just sort of like, this is a filmed version of a video game. If you're used to first person shooters, you get to watch a movie like that. But apparently, at least according to Wikipedia, which there's no actual direct attribution that Ramel Ross said, this is the connection I'm going to make. But there is a passive voice that the choice was compared heavily to a 1947 film noir called Lady in the Lake, which I did not see Hale County this morning, this evening, but I have watched Lady in the Lake, which is a first person mystery where like you feel like you are the detective trying to solve it and like interview people. And it is this really weird 1940s, like it feels like you're playing one of those like interactive games where you're like, ask this question, but you don't get to ask the question. But it has that same feel of like people looking at the camera to talk to you, the occasional like look in the mirror so you can see the actor who's playing the narrator and your perspective. So there are these movies that are out there, but we can get into it more, and I think it makes sense to get into it more in spoiler territory. That I think the mindset, the sort of ethos that Ross was bringing to this is very different from all of those. But if any people have any connections to any of those or had that experience, that's potentially another in to be like, oh, you should come check this out for the form alteration of how this was approached.
All right, I think we're ready for spoiler mode. So if you've not seen Nickel Boys and you do not want it spoiled, and I already mentioned earlier, there are things to spoil. So you have been warned. So I would say that the biggest spoiler, the biggest twist in this movie is that Elwood, I would say is, it is the main character of the movie, right? We're in his perspective the most. We learn that the adult male in the present timeline, who's we've only seen the back of his head, is actually Turner, because Turner is the one who survived and assumed Elwood's identity. Now, first of all, I just want to check. That is correct, right? That's what happens in the movie? Okay.
That is my understanding. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So my question was that at what point were you suspicious that there was something weird happening with the character who's David Diggs, for whom we only see the back of his head?
Yeah, and so for people who have foolishly ventured into spoiler warning without having seen the movie, to clarify, like we're in the first person perspective whenever we are in the scenes and in the experience of the youths in this movie, and it's Elwood and Turner. I don't believe we're ever in anyone else's point of view. It's only between the two of them. But we start with Elwood before he gets picked up by the police and sent to this, prison. I know there's another, like a boys' institution or
Reform
something.
school is the word that
Okay.
I keep seeing. That seems weirdly soft compared to what we see in the film.
Right. But
but I think that's what it's supposed to be. But functionally, it's a prison.
Yes. That's sometimes we soften the words to make experiences not seem as bad as they are for the wider world. But yes, so those are the perspectives. And then when we cut into the future, where it's very weird that this does really like the language was so video gamey to me. It's like it's the third person camera of a video game where you're like right behind, you don't see the face of the perspective person, but you see their shoulders and their head, and that's David Diggs, right?
That was me karate chopping.
Oh,
at the scream.
This is me walking into a
that
wall
too.
because I'm not able to figure out.
See, Greg, we're doing visual bits.
You'll love it. Yeah. Greg exclusively gets the video feed of the recording, so he'll see it. But yeah, that was one of the things where when they did that and they jumped forward, I was like, oh, I like that we are seeing the future of this character's experience. I didn't like that they changed perspective until that is sort of explained at the very end, which is basically once Elwood and Turner are running and Elwood is killed, and then the like camera jumps out to being behind Turner, and it's basically Turner living this lie as Elwood, or Turner maybe not lie, but Turner living the assumed identity as Elwood is what causes that. Like he's no longer seeing as himself. He's outside of himself because he's assumed another identity. So yeah, all that being said, I knew something was up. I was not smart enough. I was not like giving the movie enough credit to think that the change in camera angle was anything besides a different time period. But I knew that from the dialogue, something was up in terms of what had happened. I did not know it was a swap of identities and a change of names until the character that we think is going to survive because he's Elwood is shot and dies. And it's like, oh, and then it all like the camera shifts and it all kind of clicks and made sense to me.
For me as well. I didn't realize. Yes, there are some sort of odd things that happen. There's that scene at the bar, and asking about what happened to whatever that leads you to believe that something is amiss. But I thought it was just such skillful filmmaking, um, that this twist had sort of maximum impact for me, um, because it was unexpected yet upon reflection well seated. I think throughout the story, and yeah, I do wonder what if you've read the book. This is actually, I think, one instance in which the only way that it'll be surprise for you is if you haven't read the book, because the twist is in the book, right? So experiencing it exclusively through film and feeling that surprise here, I thought just made that moment even more sort of special and electric for me. Um, yeah. How about you, Jen?
So this is going to be really hard to explain without sounding like I'm bragging, but I'm really not. But I actually was really
Minute two.
I was
He's Kaiser Soze. Done.
So I was suspicious generally in the scene where Anjanou Ellis is the one I joked about in the opening. Anjanou, for PT's reference, where Anjanou Ellis is like, well, I can't see my own son. Can I give you a hug instead? And I was like, okay. I don't really know. I'm like clocking this. put a pin in this.
Bookmark.
This seems strange. And then I think when the scene that you mentioned, Antonio, where he's talking, he runs into someone from the school at a bar years later. That conversation made me remember the hug scene with Anjanou Ellis. And then I thought, like, and in between those two scenes, because the bar scene is when it clicked, where I was like, oh, I think I know what's going to happen. But this is going to sound terrible, but I just have to be honest. I recognize Daveed Diggs' voice. I know what Daveed Diggs looks like. Daveed Diggs is lighter skinned, like Turner, not darker skinned, like Elwood. There's no other way to explain this without sounding terrible. But for me, I was kind of like, oh no. Does that mean that they switch at some point and he takes over? He replaces Elwood and then ended up being right. So again, I'm not saying that to brag, but I'm just saying that, like, maybe then I question. I'm like, oh, should they not have hired Daveed Diggs to play the adult self? The other thing too was the withholding of showing his face, because they make such a point with young Elwood. We see lots of reflections of him in the mirror, right? And the fact that we didn't get that with adult quote unquote Elwood was automatically. So there was a bunch of things that were generally suspicious, and then it clicked at a certain point, and I was like, oh, I think I know where we're going here.
Well, I guess let me ask. Antonio and I both felt like really like hit and moved by that.
Oh, it was
revelation.
Still absolutely devastating.
Okay, yes. So you didn't feel like you're like, oh yeah,
no, I didn't feel like nonplussed. No,
okay.
No, I was dreading it for much longer. I think that's the only difference. Where I was like, oh, is it? Yeah.
Because I think this is a good time to just bring in what Greg sent to us, which is that one of his, he was much softer on this movie. He saw it before any of us. He saw an early screening of it. And it did not include any of the people who made the movie, because they don't bother going to Boston, especially the people who made this movie.
Except
you understand.
He saw the Holdovers with like the entire cast and crew of the Holdovers. Okay,
yeah, the Holdovers cast and crew looks a little different than the cast and crew of Nickelback.
Okay.
Anyway,
I
love Boston. We kid Boston. So his thing is that this is one of his favorite novels, and for him, like I guess the way the ending executed was in the sort of final pages. And again, we have not read the book, so we don't know that. But he was just like, this is one of the most like impactful things that he's read, and the sort of the twist and the impact was so incredible on the page that he didn't feel like that was translated well at all, and he thought that it was kind of cheap, but he also knew what it was going to be going into it and kind of had an idea going forward. And he also says that the book spends more time than the movie, at least as far as he can recall, years since he read the book, months since he's seen the movie, that the book spends more time with present day, the Daveed Diggs version of the character. So you get more sort of a chance to get to know that person and maybe have more of a connection between him, adult Elwood and then child Elwood, and then to find out that actually that's not what it is, was just a lot more impactful. And he thought that the execution of it was not a successful payoff, which that's fair. But again, as someone who has not read the book, I was absolutely blown away by it and thought it was done really well. And it was one of those moments when you watch a movie and it's suddenly like something happens and it answers a bunch of questions you had about like what was happening before, not just like on a plot level, but on a form and stylistic and structure level, which was I thought was very impressive. And again, not to sort of bring in anonymous voices from outside, but in reading around like what the general reviews are about the movie, there were a bunch of people who were like, oh, this takes an excellent book and makes it even better with the choices it makes in doing this. I think it's important for us to point out that our colleague, who could not be here, fundamentally disagrees with that. And it's just like, oh, it took the experience of the book and cheapened it, which is, certainly valid.
I will say that in the Daveed Diggs timeline, it did seem like there was kind of a half-hearted attempt to develop his character, because there's like a one or two scenes that are like seem like there's like a relationship subplot of like they're breaking up, I don't know, there's stuff happening where I'm just like, oh, is this going to go anywhere? And it ultimately doesn't. Like it's all a means to an end of him kind of in journalism mode, uncovering the history and kind of saying like, oh, this is all coming out now. So I can see it. I can see how if we get a whole like a half novel's worth for that adult character, and then it's sort of like this is what you get in the movie, I can definitely see how that would be dissatisfying.
And you mentioned the hug scene with Ingenue Ellis. This is something that PT and I actually talked about on the car ride over, because I do think that the first person was used to maximum dramatic effect in this film. But there were a few moments that I thought were awkwardly translated, and I think it's just because, like, I think a lot of the moments of affection actually were felt a little jarring to me, and that happens a lot in the first part of the film when I was already a little bit disoriented. But a lot of the hugs, I mean, think about what a hug would look like from the first person, and the way that it's represented in film was just like you just go to a close up of like a person's shoulder, and it's that's not going to feel like a hug, right? And that's just again a limitation of like, of the visual medium, if you're going to look at it from that perspective. And so, but also I think the moments in which, uh, when Ingenue Ellis is just sort of like looking at you directly at the screen, and you're supposed to feel the warmth. And I don't think it's a failure of like the performances. It's just jarring and sort of strange. And and I think that like moments of affection work on film because you see the connection. Embraces work because you see the angle of, two people embracing. And when you lose that and you only get sort of like one side of it in this perspective, I think it just it didn't I didn't that's a moment where I feel like I didn't feel what I think I was supposed to feel. And those were the moments where I most felt like I don't know if I'm liking this. I don't know if this is working for me, right? Whereas, earlier I alluded to like a moment of violence, and this is when when Elwood is being, like punished by the headmaster or whoever, right? And and I thought, and I was dreading this. Like I don't like watching people getting like tortured, hurt on screen. I do not like it. Um, but I thought that the way that it was represented, it's been a while, but I remember it was something. Um, there were sort of like flashes, like images that he has, right, where he's sort of like out of his body for a bit, right, and and that I thought was both restrained, but also it didn't sacrifice in sort of the power, um, and uh, I thought it was just like the absolute right choice in a really critical moment of the film, and it transcended, um, these sort of expectations that I had of like what I was gonna see, um, but it didn't sacrifice again the sort of like impact.
I think that stuff speaks to, and Jen, can you remind me the phrase? It was the banal,
Epic banal, and
epic
then
banal.
Yeah,
the phrase the term he used to describe the first person aesthetic was sentient POV,
yeah, yeah.
meaning like that so much of conventional filmmaking and continuity in filmmaking inevitably creates a distance between the viewer and the character, and that he was really trying to replicate what the sensory experience of a character, and that so that we there's a one-to-one, there's a kind of a clean mapping of our sensory experience with the character's sensory experience, and that life is, we perceive life through moments of like little bits of sound and image, right? And then why wouldn't we want to experience, like why wouldn't we want to be as close to a character as thinking and seeing and feeling the world that they in the way that they do, right? So I would say that, like, while I definitely hear what you're saying about the affection being really jarring, but I think part of the point is that like we've just been conditioned to think that in a certain way, because
Yeah.
that's what our lizard film brains have been trained to be like, oh, I feel love now because I see two people hugging in this particular
Mm.
way, whereas like the sort of like darkness that happens with the camera lens, right, when your face is being smothered into somebody's shoulder, right, that doesn't we have not been trained through classical cinema to have that emotional connection with that image, right? um So yeah, it's really interesting to think about, I think.
And it's interesting when you contrast that moment where, and I can confirm Antonio was correct that we talked about this on the drive home after the screening, that, he was like, that was when I was like, I don't know if this is working. And that was also for me, that was the moment where I was the most thinking like, there's just someone with a camera that's like probably just like on their chest that they're like going in close, like as if they're hugging this, like the logistics of how they filmed it was the most at the forefront of my mind in that moment, just the thinking about the sort of how you would execute that. I can't, maybe that was me reacting to being uncomfortable with that display of affection and connecting affection with what was happening, or I don't know why, but that's what I was thinking. But the contrast between those moments, which have that awkwardness of execution, with, like you were saying, Jen, like we are used to seeing two people hugging and it's fine, when Turner goes back after he has escaped to talk to Elwood's mom, and she starts like crying and being like, "Oh, my boy's home," and like it's devastating, and it's like, it's still that sort of over behind the shoulder, but that's not like, in the context of that one scene, that's not a different or unique camera angle to be sort of, over the shoulder, almost like over the head of one character, and just seeing sort of their shoulder, their head and shoulders in front of you, and then another character coming forward to hug them. So that should feel a little bit more normal in terms of our intake of images, but because of what's happened in the story, it's just like out of control, devastating to watch that. And I will just add that, in hearing, which again, I think we all liked the movie before we heard the director, Greg. But in hearing the director talk about it afterwards, not only was he talking about this sort of trying to get into the experience, but that the sort of traditional distant camera perspective was a sort of inherently white European colonial mindset based on proscenium stage settings passed down from Greek drama all the way to movies happening now. And so trying to shake that up is also just trying to disrupt the sort of learned and received thought processes that we all have coming from the dominant culture in filmmaking and in sort of society, Western society as a whole. And so, which I thought was really interesting. And it was also really interesting to hear him talk about that, and then have the moderator, Katie Rich, be able to turn to the cinematographer, Jomo Frey, and be like, did that make sense? And him be like, nope, but I believed in him and I tried to figure it out and we worked on it. And I really like the challenge. And now I do believe in it. And I think it all worked out. But it was just very funny that like Ramel Ross is working at this really high level philosophically and sort of theoretically. And then the other people who were there were just sort of like, so I need to just like work around this. Got it. And had to adjust their skills and their abilities to execute it and make it happen.
I think that is a perfect segue into the rhetorical situation, a segment in which we look at a film through the lens of our academic experiences. All right, all four of our regular co-hosts are writing professors, so we like to have a section of the episode dedicated to making connections to our experience as scholars and teachers. So I think for me, this was the only thing that made sense to talk about in the rhetorical situation, because it directly mirrors kind of this discussion that we as writing teachers have about the correlation between a certain style. And I put down cultural hegemony because I was trying to be fancy and scholarly, but really, like, what PT was saying too, white European colonial, all of that stuff. And I just want to kick us off with a quote from Ramel Ross about this, or kind of like tying his choice to do the first person, the sentient POV, with kind of the themes of the film about like systemic racism and abuse and all that sort of stuff. And he says, this was from an interview with AP News. He says, it's an ode to looking out of the eyes of those whose eyes have been owned by others and whose perception has been managed by others. Ross says, films that take place in the past reproduce the aesthetics of the past. I question the aesthetics of the past, right? So he's actively, by making this stylistic choice, he's kind of rebelling against kind of oppressive systems, right? And I mean, I thought of just sort of like things I've wrestled with as a teacher, being like, oh, do I teach the conventions of academic discourse when it's steeped in the history of groups of people that my students don't necessarily reflect all the time. So I don't know, what are all your thoughts about this in the film, in your own teaching experience, in what we understand about writing, wherever you want to take it?
I'll start. I teach legal writing, and in law, law is a field where if you submit something to a court where and the margins are like a half an inch off what the requirements of the court are, they'll throw out the brief, right? They won't even read it. Um, in many ways, legal writing just moves slower than any other kind of discourse. Um, and so, when we have these conversations at our like faculty meetings about like code switching and about, what the academic paper looks like, I I have to balance that with the expectation that like most of my students are trying to get into law school or trying to practice law, and there are very strict guidelines about like what that discourse needs to look like. And in a courtroom, right? Like people generally are discouraged from representing themselves and speaking in their own voices because that's not how because there is a very specific way that you need to express yourself in court. And so that there's a lot that feels very restrictive about this, and that feels can feel very oppressive, and very scary about a courtroom where the discourse that will decide for a lot of people their fate is told in a language that is completely foreign to them. So just as I think Nickel Boys has something to sort of buoy you in the end, the one thing that I will say to sort of counterbalance this is that there's a federal judge, one of the few Black federal judges in California, and she's a friend of mine. I take my class to her every year, and I went to her installation ceremony when she was becoming a federal judge, and she told the story that was just so beautiful, but so represented who she was and how she believed a courtroom should be, about how she was sentencing a defendant who didn't speak English. Um, and she was giving him a sentence, right? He was going to go to jail, but she did something that she always does when she's sentencing someone, which is that she talked about what she hoped for him and how she believed that that his life wasn't wasn't represented by the worst thing that he'd done, even though he was going to go, to jail for a certain amount of time. Her hope was that in that time he would reflect, and that he ultimately, could end up, better for the experience or a better person. Um, and the person listened, and then took a moment, said something to the translator, and then the translator turned to her and said, he wants to know if he can address you and say something to you. And she said, yes, of course. And what he said was, uh, thank you for treating me like a human being. And it's like that's why I always take my classes to her, because no matter what is going on in her courtroom, in this place where again people are scared to death, no matter how tough they are, no matter what has happened, like when you're in that kind of environment and you have people talking in a language that is English but doesn't sound like English, to have the judge on the bench, doing their best to connect with you on a human level, I think it can be a really magical thing and a really hopeful thing. So that's what it brought to my mind this here. How about UPT?
Oh, I don't have any good experiences like that. That sounds lovely. I'm glad. I'm glad that. Yeah, I'm glad the students got to meet her. But I do think that that's interesting. That your specialty is that sort of you got to know the rules in a way that I think a lot of the classes that we teach, part of this conversation, for those who listen to us for the movies and not for the faculty meeting type topics about it, but like part of the reason of this is that there's a lot of the sort of structure of, and you need to learn to write essays like this way and structure it, is this seems to be a remnant from a very, very long long ago belief that if you are in an undergraduate first year composition class, it's because you eventually want to get your PhD and join the academy and be an academic for the rest of your life. And it's like, nah, most of them don't want to do that. And also, like, the old academics aren't retiring, so there's not a lot of jobs open for them, even if they did want to do it. So, this idea of being like, you got to teach them like the sourcing, like what are the correct formatting rules for the works cited page, and making sure that you're speaking exclusively to this high-minded academic audience with that kind of tone and language and diction, and that's the like correct academic voice to put on, which of course is like, I don't know, I always say to my students, I'm just like, there were like 8 people at Oxford in like 1870 something, and those are the people you're writing to. Like, they came up with all of these rules about grammar and all of that, sitting around a table probably smoking something, and just like, that's who like the people are. And that's not who, like you said, Jen, that's not who a lot of our students are, and it's also not who they're going to be talking to. Like, that's not to whom they will be writing. So for Antonio, it totally does make sense to be like, no, like, yeah, if you're going to be a lawyer and you're going to submit things to a court, you got to know all these rules to make sure the court listens to you. And for most people, that's why rule number 1, if anybody from the justice system, law enforcement, courts, whatever, comes and talks to you, like, is get a lawyer, because the lawyer knows how to translate what you are saying into that language and knows how to talk to them. But for a lot of the rest of us who don't have those specialty classes, it's like, why are we squeezing people into these type of argumentative essay formats where it's like, like, they're only doing they we're teaching them how to write like essays in college, and then all their other classes they never write that way, and then they graduate and they don't write at all usually, or they don't write essays in the same way for the most part. So I do think there is something from our perspective as instructors where there's some leeway and wiggle room to try to say, like, let's reach into their experiences, let's reach into what they are doing or what they want to do and aim to do, and try to see how that can be something that is rewarding and interesting, and also, rigorous and challenging and all that good stuff that academic classes are supposed to be. And at least try to meet somewhere in the middle. If not, once we get to like the advanced writing classes, can let them run a little wild and be like, yeah, write kind of whatever and see what it comes up with, and then write something for the class to explain what it was that you did in a way that's maybe a little bit more formal and a little bit more reflective, but also in a sort of, lets you practice that academic mindset if that is something that you're going to use down the road.
Yeah, I think regardless of the context, discourse is fundamentally meant to keep some people in and some people out, right? And so the connection that I'm kind of making, Antonio, like your story obviously is like so inspirational and heartfelt, and like restores my system, my faith in like the legal system and all this sort of stuff. But at the same time, the specialized knowledge that you're passing on to your students is what they need to keep them inside that system, right? And to thrive in it. And for me, I'm often teaching professional or popular writing, and it's the same thing where like I have to kind of have a frank conversation with my students where like, look, you are so much more than this cover letter and the rigid format that it has to follow. You're so much more than your resume. At the same time, if you turn a haiku in as your job application, like, you're not getting a job, right? So we have to find some kind of balance and like acknowledge one and saying that your voice matters is different than learning to kind of play in the system. And so to bring it back to the movie, I feel like the really interesting thing is that like Elwood is almost too idealistic about this, because he's like, well, as long as I write everything down and document everything, then I can get out of here, right? Like, that should make sense. And yet, what the tragedy of his story, and the thing that kind of, you could argue, like, obviously the chase at the end, either one of them could have made it, right? You know what I mean? Like, physically speaking or fatally speaking. But at the same time, Turner is like, the pair of them are so interesting as a dichotomy, because Turner is the one who's like, you just got to play the game. You just got to follow the rules. You just got to keep your head down and do your time, and then you'll eventually get out of here. Whereas Elwood's like, no, like, what if there's a fifth way? What if there's a fifth way where we can, where Nickel is gone, right? And we take this place down. and ultimately he fails, right, which is very discouraging. But I mean, it just takes many, many years later where Turner as Elwood is part of this movement to uncover all the hidden graves and all of the physical forensic evidence that kind of unlocks this really dark period in the school's history, right? So
Mhm.
I don't know. Yeah, that's just kind of like my weird connect the dots
No, I mean,
framing of it.
the quote that I started with was Elwood's quote, right? About you have to walk through it, walk with your head up, no matter what they throw at you. It's in response to a quote from Turner where he says, "You got to watch how people act, what they
Hmm.
do, and then you try to figure out how to get around them like an obstacle course. I mean, if you want to walk out of here, right?" So Turner is presented as this very sort of like savvy person who understands the system that they're in, understands how it operates, and he wants to get out just as much as Elwood wants to get out, but he's using all the things that he's learned to sort of do it in the most, you know, the least dangerous way possible for him, right? And he views a lot of Elmore's idealism as a kind of naivete and dangerous, right?
Yeah.
And it's telling the dynamic between them is so beautifully played, right? That the moment that leads to the climax is Turner finally deciding like, this is it, we're gonna go now, right? And I'm gonna throw caution to the wind. And I've been watching how people act, and I know it's dangerous, but we're gonna do this tonight, right? And that's part of the excitement of seeing that, not only just like them physically, escaping, but him just deciding like enough is enough.
Yeah.
um, yeah,
And it's the realization that the other inmate the boxer, right, who
yeah,
doesn't throw the
oh,
Mhm.
he doesn't throw the fight
yeah,
because he like misunderstood what he was supposed to do or something, like, right, it didn't seem like he was doing it willfully,
yeah,
and that they knew that that meant he was gonna die, and that like it was just it was really heartbreaking because I feel like there's a lingering shot on him looking out at the guy who he made the secret deal to throw the fight with, right? And pleading with him, being like, I didn't know it was the third round, right? And it's just like, like that's and it's because yeah, it's like he's not playing the system, he's not paying attention in the way that Turner is, in a way that,
yeah.
sealed his fate. So oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
as a quick shout out to Hamish Linklater, who is I typically think of as a comic actor. I mean, he was in the what was it? The Midnight,
Midnight Mass.
the horror, yeah, Midnight Mass, and he was excellent in that. But I also know him from like the New Adventures of Old Christine, and typically he's
Mhm.
like a very funny character. He is quite menacing
Yeah.
in this film, and and unexpected, just an unexpected like layers to that performance that really made those scenes really chilling.
And like from the jump, like that in first scene with him where he's explaining
Oh yeah,
he has the chalkboard, and I don't remember what's on
yeah,
the chalkboard, but it's some terrifying like system of like how you can go up or down in the
yeah,
in the yeah. Ugh. And I feel like they did a really good job of, without anyone speechifying, just what they're showing and kind of what we're listening in on very
yeah.
quickly tells you all you need to know about this place and how corrupt it is, and like
Mm.
how abusive it is, and how like it's definitely, while they are saying that they're trying to kind of reform the behavior of these people, like that is definitely not what's happening. Right, that they're
Yeah,
exploiting them for their labor, they're abusing them, it's this weird power struggle, like yeah.
And every time it seems like there's someone who it's like, oh, well, this woman, you can go and just work at like, it's the wife. I don't know if it's Hamish Linklater's wife. It's the wife of one of the employees, and they're like, we can work around here. We can make this last for a few days. It's just sort of like, oh, well, like that's a respite. Like she must be nice, but it's also she's like totally illegally using them for like free labor. There's our long take review superstar Fred Heckinger from Thelma and Gladiator 2, who's the white boy who's like, we can go and run errands and do do these like deliveries and drop-offs of things, and it seems like, oh, that's a way to like be out of it, but like he's not your friend, like he's not going to help you, and he'll turn on you as soon as the moment it's no longer helpful for him to be around. So yeah, it's just this just like it does a really good job, which, again, maybe could have been done with a traditional filming, but because of that first person perspective, like seeing the people through the eyes of the characters, you could just sort of feel like all these little, like what seems like rays of hope kind of falling away, and these little like, oh, this is a path, this is a way, leading up to, of course, the actual moment of trying to escape and riding away on these bikes, which ends tragically.
So I do want to make sure we talk about we've talked about the first person perspective so much, and rightly so. That's the most signature visual thing about this, right? That's challenging the aesthetics of past filmmaking. But it also, I alluded to this briefly earlier, talking about documentary filmmaking, but it especially towards the end, as we learn more about the present day uncovering of this history, it cuts to so many still images of objects, like as if they were tagged, like being uncovered today as opposed to used back then. What do you feel like those, and just kind of like any of the close-ups on objects, like there's a lot of fixation on objects in this movie, like what does that add to the story, do you think?
To connect to something you said earlier, on a macro level, we remember in events. We remember in like, oh, this happened this year. This is the year we got married, whatever. But on an everyday level, our memories are triggered like Proust's Madeleine, right? Our memories are triggered by images and sounds, and often, right, like you'll see something, you'll see a familiar image that will automatically like bring you back to something. And I feel like that's what this is trying to replicate, and I think it does so really effectively. What do you think, PT?
I agree. I mean, the moment when I was like won over, which, this is early in the movie, but the moment when I was first like, oh, this is working. I get this, which,
Mhm.
whatever. The movie doesn't need my blessing to work. But the moment when I had that experience of like, oh, was before he's sent to Nickel Boys and Elwood sitting in his kitchen, and I can't remember if it's like the mom gets a phone call. I think it's something about how he's going to try to go to that school in Florida, like that's to do like science, like a special science program. And he's
Mhm.
looking at the fridge, and there's just a magnet that's slowly sliding, like it doesn't
Mhm.
quite hold and it slides down. And it's like that felt like such a perfect kid memory of just like
Yeah.
what the magnet is like, and like how it's moving, and how you fixate on something like that when you don't want to actually look at the thing that's like this big thing that's happening around you. And that comes up a few times. And then, there are some of those moments when you have the documentary, the documented evidence of sort of, here are the things that we have found in the excavation of the campus of or whatever, the grounds of this place that we're putting online. We want people to come and report if they know anything. And it's just like, oh, that's the coin that was in that earlier scene. Or, this is, the, like, we saw people using this object earlier. And, to me, that just felt like how, when you see something like that, and, we were not in this type of a situation. I don't believe none of us had this experience and lived through it. And so even if you just go beyond reading a news story and you go to like, well, here's the website where they put out all this information, you look through it, it is just like this, it's a litany of images where you're like, wow, interesting. But like each of those contain someone somewhere's memory of some moment in their lives that is either, the one of the worst moments of their lives, maybe a very good moment, maybe just a boring everyday moment. But that we are getting that experience of seeing like a bunch of things we don't connect to, and then staying on something where it was, oh, right, we connect with that in the audience because the character is connecting with that. And how, it's showing, it's showing because it is the, what's left from this terrible place and what's been excavated, that there's a tangible memory of the devastation in the world that we can go and look at. And it only has meaning to the people who are there, or true meaning to the people who are there.
Right, and it also kind of speaks to like the big flaw in kind of archiving and history making, that these objects, that we have to do it through the material, right? And that we're
Mhm.
limited by material objects, and that, after all the dust settles, that the horrible actions that we see in past timeline parts of the film with young Elwood and Turner, right? Like that those are completely vaporized and like they're not tangible, but all we have left are like the spoons and the cups and the and the
Mhm.
like the
Yeah.
little like mundane objects. And there's something very like when they flashed those, especially because I think they increase kind of in frequency the farther towards the end of the film we get. They just became more and more haunting to me in a way that like suddenly these objects took on this sort of like ghost like quality
Yeah.
of like they're just these empty objects that are just they're the only thing left of this horrible past that we've been living through for the whole movie. So
I have also seen online collections of paired shots from the movie from, I mean, not necessarily early and the beginning
people
and the end.
finding the scene the object was in.
Yeah,
Kind
or
of.
even like that. But then also there's like a moment when they are watching, and I don't remember the name of the movie, but it's a movie from a few years before this was set, like an early 50s movie that has, I think, Sidney Poitier and another actor who I don't recall, who are escaping from prison and
Oh,
they
it's
have
the
to
date.
escape.
It's the date that Elwood goes on, right?
Yes, that is correct, I think. But anyway, it's like we see a couple scenes of that. I think it's on a TV. I don't know if it's like, I don't think they go to a theater. I could be wrong. But anyway, we see like a scene from it. It's like
I might be conflating it with The Complete Unknown, which is terrible. Because that has a like the I know it's a
yes.
very different movie than what you're describing that they watch, but yeah, okay. I'll look it up while you're talking.
It is, yeah. Well, but there's like the quotes from that movie where Sidney Poitier is talking about, we have to do this and we got to do that, are reflected in things that happen during the escape or in the plan for the escape later on in the movie. The Defiant Ones.
Sidney Poitier and Tony Curtis.
So yeah, I mean, this is there. I think there's, it's one of those things where we are somewhat doing a discredit to the movie, talking about it 5-6 weeks after we've seen it and being like, yes, I remember that movie. I mean, I think it was like so memorable and stirring that it's fair to discuss it. But I also think that upon a rewatch, there's a lot more in there in the visual language beyond just that change in form and that sort of change in perspective, that even from what maybe is a more traditional thinking about like parallel shots, paired images, that would take that found object idea from those stuff at the end of the movie, but even just other aspects of things that are seen and elevate them through the echoes that happen across the movie.
So this reference is actually very clever because I'm reading the Wikipedia page now. It stars Tony Curtis and Sidney Poitier as two escaped prisoners, one white and one black, so obviously that's not the same, who are shackled together and who must cooperate in order to survive. So it's like, that seems like a very deliberate reference to Elwood and Turner. Wow. Okay.
It's supposed to be a good movie. I've not seen it.
Yeah, I want to go see this
but
movie
I've heard
now.
good things about it.
Are we ready for Oscars watch? All right. So as we said, this is nominated for 2 Oscars.
Can I get the music? What's happening?
I was vamping till I found the cue. Oh, it's okay. Here's the music.
Less than 2 weeks until the night. Let's go.
Oh my gosh.
As of recording.
That's too soon. I'm not ready. So it's nominated for Best Picture, which, to recap, was a surprise to me. I was not actually expecting that. Some people were predicting that, but it just seems so far out there because this mostly seems like a critic's favorite as opposed to like an industry favorite, because the stylistic choices, I think, are polarizing for some people. But it's Best Picture and Best Adapted Screenplay, which it has now won the WGA, and I believe it won one other thing. I want to say was it Golden Globes or Critics' Choice?
Was it the USC Scripter? Was it the USC Scripter Award?
Well, it's nominated at Scripter, but I don't know if they've announced the winner Scripter yet.
That's right.
Which that should be soon. I feel like we should be more on top of that, being USC employees.
Well, they should invite us for free.
Yeah, well,
if they want us to be on top of it.
This is the thing, is that, okay, so listeners, we have looked into this in case you're like, you work at USC, why don't you go to the USC Scripter Awards? We did investigate this. It's so out of our league, like, because it's run by the USC libraries, but it is as primarily like a fundraiser. And so it's sort of like a ticket costs several $1,000s as a donation in order to attend. So yeah, we're
Yeah, we're
we're
out.
not, yeah, we're not worthy.
I mean, there was some various regional critics groups that it won Best Director and Breakthrough Performer at the Gotham Awards. It won Best Director and Best Cinematography at the New York Film Critics Circle Awards. It won Best Cinematography at the Los Angeles Film Critics Association. All due respect, after having implied the whole city is racist earlier, the Boston Society of Film Critics gave it Best Adapted Screenplay. So do credit there. It was the National Society of Film Critics gave it cinematography and Best Picture. And then besides that, it's gotten a lot of nominations, and we're waiting. It won a bunch at the Black Reel Awards.
Nice.
So that got screenplay, breakthrough screenwriter, emerging director, cinematography, director, and film. And then we're waiting on the Independent Spirit Awards, and of course, these two Academy Awards.
Yeah, so do you feel like it actually has a shot at screenplay at the Oscars because of all that, or no?
I think it has a shot. Yeah.
I think it has a shot. It has an outside shot. It's not mine. Here's a theory that I saw and I did sort of attach to, because the assumption has been Conclave has locked up adapted screenplay. And Nickel Boys did win at the Writers Guild Association Awards, as we were discussing earlier. But Conclave was not nominated because of the various Writers Guild rules. A bunch of movies aren't nominated. Conclave was one of them. So did it win that? However,
Yeah, so for listeners who don't know what we're talking about, so the WGA is the main guild that has sort of stricter eligibility rules, because you actually have to be like a paying member of the WGA in order to be eligible to be nominated. And so a lot of writers, like famously Quentin Tarantino has never been a member of the WGA, and so his screenplays never get nominated even though they've won Oscars. So it is a weird thing where like it does matter as a precursor, but the competition with the nominees is so different than the slate at the Oscars usually that it's hard to compare.
So I am looking right now at the Awards Watch Who Won What, which is very lingo based. It's all acronyms. But Conclave has won 15 awards, and that's regional as well as sort of big awards that are out there. And it won the Golden Globes against both adapted and original, a field of both adapted and original, because the Golden Globes only have the one screenplay award. So Conclave has won 15, certainly the front runner. Nickel Boys has won 8. And Sing Sing has won 7, but it doesn't feel like Sing Sing has won much recently, and none of the more prominent ones. So here's the fact, Jen. You love trends, you love facts. So I'm telling this to you, Antonio. You're welcome to listen as well.
Give
I
it
don't
to
know
me.
if you care as much. This was like from a series of sort of like a thread on the Oscar race subreddit, and I didn't grab the screen name, so I apologize. I'm sure at least one of the screen names is an abomination that should not be read on mic, but that's just the way of the internet. So the last 6 winners of adapted screenplay were all writer-directors, which Conclave notably is not, because the Conclave was written by someone not Edward Berger. So last 6 winners were all writer-directors.
Peter Strahan. Sorry, I just want to get the name.
Okay.
I think that's who it is.
I can't confirm that. I'll just assume that you're correct because you know more about this. But the last 5 winners, so if you go back 6, it's Black Klansman. It's Spike Lee and his co-writers for Black Klansman won adapted screenplay. Spike Lee was also nominated for Best Director that year, and also the movie was nominated for Best Picture. All of the intervening years since then, it is writer-directors who were not nominated for directing, but who were nominated in adapted screenplay, and then won adapted screenplay for their movie. Taika Waititi for Jojo Rabbit, the woman who wrote Coda, Sean
Hader.
Thank you. So yeah, Taika Waititi for Jojo Rabbit, Florian Zeller for The Father co-writer, Sean Hader for Coda, Sarah Polley for Women Talking, and Cord Jefferson for American Fiction. So in that line, it would not make sense if this trend were to continue. It would not make sense for Conclave to win. It would feel like, well, this is a place where we could honor Nickel Boys, because maybe some people think this should have been nominated in director. Maybe they like all the ways in which this was put out there. Maybe the fact that it snuck into Best Picture speaks to that, like, it was not out there that much. And maybe in the time between the nomination voting and the awards voting, people have had more of a chance to see it and are now like, oh, wow, like this is a movie that deserves an award. Conclave will win something somewhere else, or Conclave has won a bunch of awards already. And this is, this movie that is, tackling more serious, maybe it is more American, but still more serious issues than All Due Respect. The what exactly is happening in the more potboiler story of Conclave, that people will switch over to this. And so I don't think it's enough to say, oh, well, we should predict it over Conclave, but I do think that is interesting that maybe because this is the only place that, unless they wanted to give it Best Picture, they want to reward Ramel Ross for everything he did around this movie, that maybe it has a chance to take that Writers Guild momentum, even though it feels weird because it's like, well, Conclave wasn't there, but just the fact that there's a win and it gets people to think about it, may combined with this kind of trend, which I don't think is conscious. I don't think people are actively thinking about it, but there is like, are we rewarding someone with an Oscar for a movie when all they did, quote unquote, all they did was write a screenplay? Or are we rewarding them for all of this vision and all of this thing that they did, with the directing and the like, setting up all of this, and they get an Oscar out of it for the screenplay?
That's a really compelling argument.
Okay.
But
I was thinking Nickel Boy should have gotten more when we did the LTRs. Like when we left, that was the thing that I was like, why didn't we should have done more? Because we gave it to Sing Sing. We gave adapted screenplay to Sing Sing, and we gave Hitman the honorable mention. I know there's a lot of love for Hitman. I also loved Hitman. When I looked back the next day, I was like, why didn't we give at least the honorable mention to Nickel Boys?
We gave Anjanou Ellis a shout out, a nomination in supporting. Yeah. And
we gave Ramel Ross honorable mention for director underneath Denis Villeneuve, that's very fair. But anyway,
I think not like an age well, probably.
Hey,
we'll see.
No,
we'll see.
I mean, listen. Let's not. There's no reason to speak ill of Dune Part 2, especially when Greg isn't here to lead the charge. Here's my question: if I don't think it's really possible, but we want to talk about win package. Spotlight won Best Picture with just picture and screenplay wins. Is it in any way possible? And Coda won with just winning its 3 nominations, which was in the entirety of its nominations, which included supporting actor, but it swept what it got nominated for. Is there any chance Nickel Boys does that?
I'm gonna say no.
Okay, I think that's fair.
I agree with Jen.
I mean, I think it just snuck in there in the nominations for Best Picture. I think it's in the last spot probably. So and with so many other strong contenders and less consensus, I think it's just one of those things that's like, and it hasn't built any momentum. That's the thing. Like, I have not seen that movie other than the event we went to. I have not seen a ton of campaigning happening on behalf of Nickel Boys, and maybe it's happening and I'm just not noticing it. But I think, like, I was watching the live stream of WGAs, and PT pointed out that Kyle Buchanan of the New York Times pointed out that the speeches were very short and in some cases non-existent because people were trying to get to BAFTA. Like, they had to go to the airport right afterwards. But I just felt like Ramel Ross, he what he said was fine, but he kind of, I was like, take the opportunity, dude. Like tell us, let's say all the things that you said to us. Like, that would, like, you can easily spellbind this audience. Come on. But maybe but I think he didn't know it was being televised, like live. He was like, "Wait, is this live?" Because I think he made a joke about, well, this award means the most because the writers are the smartest, right? And he's like, and don't tell that to the other guilds. He's like, oh wait, is this live? It was very funny.
That's funny.
And yeah, so yeah, I just feel like the momentum and the passion's not there.
The only thing I'll say is there's some momentum bubbling under in that they won the Writers Guild Award, and he won the first time feature film at the Directors Guild. So I mean, that's not the big award, of course, but like, it's been slowly winning at things. I think you're right. I mean, I don't think it's actually possible. I just like thinking about the what ifs of it. But like, in the sense that I I've sort of been thinking for a while that like maybe could Sing Sing get like a adapted screenplay, like Run, When a Complete Unknown was kind of surging. I think at this point, Nickel Boys feels like the strongest challenger to Conclave in adapted screenplay. Probably not strong enough, but I think that would be great. Assuming that there is maybe now we're at the point where that's all Conclave will win is adapted screenplay, and it's not going to get anything anywhere else. So then maybe that's a different equation for voters. But I think it would be great if it won adapted screenplay.
I do think the strongest argument in its favor is that it's the only place for people to really throw, like if they're passionate about it, they want to make sure it gets something. It has fewer places to put that passion vote than Conclave does. Conclave has lots of places you could reward it. So I do think that's what would be the main thing working in its favor.
I will note, looking at the 5 nominees again, Conclave is the only one where the director is not one of the people nominated for screenplay in adapted.
Nice.
So any winner besides Conclave continues that trend.
Yeah, it's a strong time for writer-directors. Like I think even James Mangold, he rewrote the screenplay for Complete Unknown, right? So he has a screenplay credit on it too.
And I don't know about September 5th. Let me see. All of the original screenplays are also writer-directors. I had to check if September 5 was one of the directors. One of the writers was the director, and it is. So yeah, it's very strong. You're right.
Yeah, while Nickel Boy is probably not going to do too much on Oscar Sunday, I do think that this award season has been very promising for Ramel Ross, and that hopefully people will know to invest in him in the future and help him continue to make innovative, boundary-pushing movies.
The movie's surprising to get in. I mean, it wasn't even certain it would get the adapted screenplay nomination. So the movie's surprising enough to get into Best Picture. That's a big win for it, considering where it was 10 minutes before nominations were announced. So hopefully more people have gone out to see it. Hopefully more people have listened to almost an hour and a half after editing of this episode because they went out and saw it. And hopefully they're able to take in this wonderful movie.
And I believe it is going to be on Amazon.
Yes.
Amazon Prime Video, right? Or is it already?
When I was reading through, it was like the speculation was that it was going to be in theaters for like a week or two, and then in the fall was going to go onto Amazon, sort of like American Fiction, where I think American Fiction was up on Prime before like even the Golden Globes happened, I think. But then I don't know, they extended its run in the theaters and they were doing more of the events with people. So hasn't gone up yet, but yeah, in theory, it will eventually be on Prime. So hopefully people check it out.
Hollywood Reporter is estimating late March or early April. So it sounds like they're going to hold it on VOD so they can make the most money out of it off us wanting to see Oscar movies, and then put it on Amazon Prime after the Oscars, which honestly makes sense because if it is, if people catch the Oscars and they're like, oh, hey, what's this movie Nickel Boys that got nominated? Then, oh, look, it's already on Amazon Prime. So I get it. All right. I am really glad that we got a review in for this movie. Since we did see it a little while ago, it was possible it was going to get lost in the busy shuffle of Oscar season. So I'm glad we took the time out. Antonio, thanks for joining us. Where can folks find you? And I know there's only one place.
You can find me on Letterboxd at Aelefano, AELEFANO PT. Where can they find you?
They can find me on Letterboxd at PT McNiff, PTMCNIFF. You can also find the show there at LTR Pod, or look for us on Threads, Instagram, or Blue Sky at The Long Take Review. You can email us, thelongtakereview@gmail.com, or you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your shows, wherever you're listening right now. Just hit subscribe and follow along. Jen, where can folks find you?
You can find me on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at Sopchockchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI. And you can find me on Letterboxd at Qui-Gon Jen.
And Greg is just pounding outside saying, read the book, read the book.
Yes,
That's his final message.
We will read the book, Greg, eventually. It's on my list. It might be 5 years from now. Let's see. Maybe the next time Ramel Ross gets nominated for an Oscar, I will have read
I hate to think how long I've had The Underground Railroad and haven't read it by Colson Whitehead. And I need to read that before I go to Nickel Boys because I've already paid for it.
So coming up next, we're really bad about doing this, but I feel like I now need to plug what's happening. Greg is always really the ghost of Greg, pushing me to do things because he's usually pretty good about like doing the actual podcasty things. But
But
we're
then at the end of
hoping-
the episode, he just wants to go to bed. So he's like, yeah.
So we're hoping to complete our Best Picture nominee reviews. We only have one Best Picture nominee left. That is I'm Still Here. We apologize, Brazil. We're gonna get to it. Don't come at us. We are Fernando Torres allies.
The good people in Brazil can go get some ice cream and wait. We'll be there soon. We promise. That'll make sense when you've seen the movie.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I still have to see it. Antonio still needs to see it. So that's probably our next review, and then we'll do a huge slew of Oscar predictions right before the Oscars. It's been such a chaotic award season that we feel like we have to kind of wait until the last possible second, so we have as much intel and information and clues as possible. But until then.